So, thank you very much for asking me. It's a pleasure to talk about C.S. Lewis. What I want to do in this talk is to kind of way just explore why he is so interesting, why people talk about him so much, some of the things you might find in him. And obviously, I'm only going to talk for about 45 minutes, so I will be limited in what I can say, but we will have a time of Q&A afterwards, and you're welcome to take the conversation in any direction that you like. So let's begin by asking, who is C.S. Lewis? And as Vaughan was saying a few moments ago, Lewis was born in Northern Ireland, except it wasn't called Northern Ireland back in the 1890s. It became Northern Ireland in the 1920s. But he has these Irish roots. And if you are here from Ireland, that may actually come as a surprise to you, because most people in Ireland think of Lewis as a very English writer. But he was born in Belfast. He spent the first 18 years of his life there before beginning this long link with Oxford, which really continued for the rest of his life. Yes, he went to Cambridge, and we forgive him for that, but he did stay living in Oxford because that was where his heart was. So let me try and sketch who this man is and the kind of reasons he is interesting. So Lewis grew up in Northern Ireland, which is a very interesting place. It shaped him in many ways. And while he was there, he began to fall into some ways of thinking that he would later describe as a kind of rather rigid doctrinaire atheism. But he did love reading Norse mythology. He found a tension in his life, actually, between the extremely rationalist demands of his atheism and the sense of imaginative delight he experienced in reading, for example, some of the Nordic myths. So Lewis arrived here in Oxford in 1917. He was going to study classics. He actually won a scholarship to UNIV. But in fact, he didn't really begin his studies at all because he had to train for military service, because Lewis was of the age for military service. This was during the First World War, and basically Oxford had more or less shut down. Some of you will know that UNIV, in fact, became a hospital during the First World War, and Lewis went to train in an officer cadet unit based at Keble College. And during that time, he made some very close friends. He made 4 very close friends. One of the most poignant moments in one of his letters is, there were 5 of us in training at Oxford, and I'm the only one who came back. Because the First World War had this massive attrition rate. And in many ways, the First World War hardened Lewis's atheism. If there is a God, how dare he allow something as vicious and nasty as the First World War to take place? But Lewis, I think it's fair to say, began to drift in his atheism. He began by studying classics here at Oxford, and then did a first degree in English, which is meant to last 3 years in 1 year, and got first-class honours. So actually, Lewis was really quite intelligent, and during this time, he was reflecting all the time on what life is all about. And if you want to read his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, you'll find some of these lines of thoughts explored. Now, I will touch on some of them, but only some, and there are many more that we need to look at. But here's where Lewis was in the early 1920s. He was really thinking something like this. Well, you know, atheism makes a lot of sense, but it is rather dull and uninteresting, and it doesn't engage my imagination at all. In fact, it is so rationalist, it restricts me. If you like, it's tying me in to a very limited and limiting understanding of the world. And let me read you Lewis describing his dilemma. This is from Surprised by Joy. The 2 hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So Lewis there is describing a tension he felt in his life. His reason pointed that way, his imagination, his intuitions pointed that way. How could he resolve these? And as many of you will know, one of the hallmarks of Lewis's thinking is his reconciliation of reason and imagination, and that happened partly because of his conversion to Christianity. But let me tell you about Lewis's history. So we've got to him doing a degree in English, and then in October 1925, Lewis was appointed fellow and tutor in English language and literature at Magdalen College. And if anybody's here from Magdalen, you'll probably have been shown where his rooms were. I have to say, it's in a new building. This is Oxford, so the new building is actually nearly 250 years old. But basically, I mean, that was really his base for thinking, writing, and wondering. Because Lewis was wondering. One of the people who helped him to wonder was somebody who he met in October 1925 at an English faculty meeting in Merton College. And this person was JRR Tolkien. And if you read Lewis's letters from the late 20s, early 30s, you have this remarkable sense of a growing friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, where they are talking about literary projects or books they would like to write. And Lewis, in effect, was very taken by an imaginative work of really almost like mythology, a fantasy work. And he encouraged Tolkien to keep going because this was so interesting. And later in one of his letters says, for a long time, The Lord of the Rings had only one reader, and that was C.S. Lewis. And what Lewis offered me was encouragement to keep going. So Tolkien and Lewis actually formed this quite deep friendship. And Tolkien was a Catholic, he was a very active Christian, and actually began to talk to Lewis about aspects of faith. So Lewis himself was uncertain about his atheism and began to move in a Godward direction. You can see traces of this in the early 20s, where Lewis at various points reflects and says, philosophically, the idea of God does make some sense. But Lewis's shift to Christianity really took place in two stages. One of them was probably in 1929. I think it might just be in 1930, but let's assume it is 1929, where Lewis talks about becoming the most reluctant convert in all England because he felt God was real, not just something which he was reading about, something that actually took possession of his life. And that was the first stage in his conversion. Lewis began to believe in God. But he was unable to see how, for example, Jesus Christ fitted into this picture. And that really was resolved in 1931, when Lewis moved from what I would call a rather generalized belief in God to a very specific belief in Christianity. And again, step in J.R.R. Tolkien, who in effect was instrumental in this transition from a sort of theism to Christianity. And you probably all know the story, it is true, of J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, who later became Merton Professor of English here at Oxford, and Lewis walking around and around Addison's Walk in Magdalen College on a Saturday night in September 1931, talking about the idea of myth, or the idea of story, and talking of saying Christianity is a story. It talks about things that happened and what this story means for us. And Lewis really uses the language of somebody turning a light on. Suddenly he began to see things in a new way. And he wrote, immediately afterwards, this remarkable letter to his childhood friend, Walt, back in Northern Ireland, where he describes in detail his changed thinking about the whole issue of faith. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but you need to understand this is actually very important for Lewis. Why? If you are a psychologist, you will know all about this, so forgive me for just going over stuff you already know. But the whole idea of meaning in life is known to be enormously important. And meaning has multiple elements. It's all about a sense of coherence. It's all about having a sense of purpose. And it's also having a sense of what we might call personal value, a sense that I matter as an individual. And all of those things Lewis found in Christianity. And for me, I have to say, as someone who came up to Oxford back in 1971, studied chemistry, initially an atheist, then discovered Christianity, and was struggling to actually quite understand what this thing called Christianity was, until my friends at Oxford, I think, fed up with my persistent questioning, said, look, for heaven's sake, go and start reading C.S. Lewis. So I did, and I still read them to this day because there's just so much there to discover. But this is the quotation that attracted my attention back then, and this is the idea that Christianity makes sense of the world. Many of you will know this quote. It's from a lecture at Oxford in 1945, and he writes these words: "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And the point Lewis is trying to make is that Christianity allows you, well, it's a bit like a lens. It brings things into focus. It's like a sun illuminating a landscape so you can see better and more clearly than otherwise you might. And in many ways, this excited Lewis and began this long process of exploration which really brought him to discover Christianity in more detail. So that is who Lewis was up until about 1935, 1936. And then things begin to happen. I'm going to try and describe what these are and explain why they are so interesting. One of the key themes I want you to understand is how important Lewis realized stories were. Stories capture our imagination. They are, in effect, things that really excite us, and we find ourselves drawn into these stories. And Lewis began to realize the importance of telling stories to explore ideas, to explore worldviews. And he began to do this, actually, in the late 1930s. Lewis loved reading H.G. Wells, but didn't like the kind of worldview that H.G. Wells included in his novels, like The Time Machine or The War of the Worlds. And he developed the idea of writing fiction, which would allow him to tell stories, but at the same time to begin to open up questions about worldviews. And so in his science fiction trilogy, for example, we find Lewis beginning to use these stories to critique, for example, those who thought that scientific advance was uniformly positive. There are downsides. Lewis is very, very clear about that. But I think the really important point to begin our discussion is a book he wrote called The Problem of Pain. This came out in 1940. Here is the important point you need to think of. Lewis was wondering, what am I meant to be doing in life? Remember, psychology? Purpose. What was Lewis's purpose? And Lewis was very happy being tutor at Malden, but he felt there was something else he ought to be doing, something that could allow him to express his faith. We might almost use the language of calling. And then Lewis found that he was asked to write a book he hadn't intended to write. And the book was The Problem of Pain. Some of you will have read that. It's a very good book, still to this day. Even though some people think it's a bit cerebral in its analysis of suffering, it's a well-written book. And that book was, in effect, commissioned. Someone said to Lewis, look, we know about you. We think you write well. We want you to write a book about the problem of suffering. Could you do it? And Lewis suddenly realized that this was what he was meant to be doing. He was an atheist who knew why he was an atheist, who'd become a Christian and knew why he'd become a Christian, and so in effect felt maybe there's something I can do. Maybe I can do this better than most, but it's certainly something I can do. And I'm sure many of you are wondering what you are meant to be doing in life. And you may well know that in many cases by somebody tapping you on the shoulder and saying, could you do this? And it gives you clues. And certainly that's what Lewis discovered with The Problem of Pain. Because it's a very interesting book in which Lewis is beginning to turn his hand to offering a Christian way of looking at things, in this case, the problem of suffering. Now let's look at that phrase I've just used in more detail, a new way of looking at things. One of the more obscure controversies that Lewis got involved in the late 1920s is called the personalist heresy. He got involved with the Cambridge academic E.M. Tillyard, and the key question really is, what is literature for? And Lewis's answer is this. Lewis says that a poet or a writer is not someone who says, look at me, but rather somebody who says, look through me. I want you to see what I have seen. In other words, what Lewis is really trying to do is, through his writings, to open up a very big vision of reality which he himself has seen, partly through reading other writers, George Herbert is a particular favorite, but also because he wants to try and express his Christianity in literary terms. And Lewis uses this analogy. He says a poet is not a spectacle who says, "Look at me," but rather a set of spectacles, "Look through me." And in many ways, that's what Lewis is very, very good at doing. He enables us to step inside a worldview, a way of understanding the world, and from inside look at the world and see how the worldview changes the way in which you see, understand, feel, and appreciate the world that's around us. And that's something that Lewis does very, very well, and I'll talk more about that when I come to talk about Narnia. But I want, if I may, to come back to my main line of discourse. We've got as far as the problem of pain, and the problem of pain sold well, and it was read by many people, including a producer at the British Broadcasting Corporation. And the BBC needed to have someone who would be able to talk about religious matters to the British people during the Second World War. They did not want to use bishops or anything like that. They wanted, in effect, someone who could speak as an ordinary person. And that's one of the reasons why Lewis, in many of his writings, emphasizes, "I am just a layman of the Church of England." And so they asked Lewis to give a set of talks on, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And they were very well received. The BBC asked him to give 3 more series spread over a number of years. And if you're wondering what happened to those 4 series of talks, you will find them lightly edited in Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity was published in the early 1950s, but it's basically those 4 broadcast series, slightly rewritten. But if you're wondering why there are 4 books in Mere Christianity, it's because there were 4 original broadcast talks. And I'll come back to that in a moment. This made Lewis very, very well known. And Lewis now felt able to begin to become more adventurous. So he wrote, for example, the Screwtape Letters, a remarkable book. It gives what you might call very traditional spiritual advice, but from a completely unexpected angle. Imagine, he says, that there are the whole series of devils trying to tempt you. How would they do it, and what can you learn from that? And the very, very good use of humor in that book, again, really appealed to people. And that was the book in the States that really began to highlight Lewis as someone who was taking a new approach to Christianity, and his fans began to accumulate in the United States, and they've kept on accumulating ever since. So Lewis is a very, very able writer, able to write academic works, but also to speak very effectively at the popular level. And that, I think, is a very important point to make, that Lewis is one of those people who writes very fluidly. When you read him, you find the prose attractive, you keep going, and indeed you find you keep coming back to it because you feel you've missed something the first time round, you will see it perhaps the next or the one after that time you read it. But the key point is that Lewis's style is so good that it makes it easy to follow him even when he's making some quite difficult points. So you find works like, his science fiction trilogy being very readable, but making some very serious points. For example, That Hideous Strength, published in August 1945, is really saying that, look, science is something which may have begun as being our servant, it's going to end up as our master, and it's going to, in effect, mean that at some point we take a step in scientific advance. That means we can now do things, and we cannot undo that. And therefore, we're entering a new world. And as many of you will know, Lewis's book was published on August the 13th, 1945, weeks after the 2 atomic bombs in Japan. And many of his readers sort of got the point that we are moving into unknown territory. We're taking steps we cannot undo. Are we ready for this decisive change in things? It's a feeling many of us have thought about, perhaps in relation to artificial intelligence, but certainly Lewis is anticipating it back then. But now I need to begin to focus on something I think that is really quite important. I've stressed that Lewis is someone who really loves stories. As a child, he really reveled in books like Squirrel Nutkin and things like that, and really found that these captivated his imagination. And Lewis was very interested in this question of how you communicate Christianity. He tried to do it in Mere Christianity, of course, but he began to get this idea that he would like to find some way of being able to somehow present Christianity in a way that would appeal to younger people. And in many ways, the Chronicles of Narnia are stories which, in effect, if you like, are transpositions or rewritings of this basic theme of what Christianity is all about. And I think this is perhaps the book for which Lewis, the series of books for which Lewis is best known. So I'd like to talk a little bit about this series and how it came to be written and why it is so interesting. And again, the emphasis I want to place is on stories. So keep that point in mind. We don't entirely understand how Lewis came to write these books. He makes a number of comments in some of his letters, and they're not entirely consistent with each other. But it seems as if Lewis had this idea that it ought to be able to retell, to re-narrate the Christian basic story in terms that would connect up with our contemporary culture. And in many ways, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the first published in the series of the Chronicles of Narnia, illustrates this point very well. What Lewis is trying to do is to make an appeal to the imagination to help you understand what this is all about. So what we need to, I think, begin by appreciating is simply that Lewis saw this as being something rather experimental, rather interesting, and potentially rather exciting. And so what he's trying to do is to re-narrate Christianity, tell stories that would allow some of its key themes to be represented and reinterpreted in ways that in effect make sense to a wide readership. Now, I remember reading the Chronicles of Narnia when I was 22. So I'm rather a late starter in this. But one of the things that I've found is that there are many people who have read Narnia at a very early stage, and it's kind of had a formative influence on them ever since. But let's try and bring out one point that Lewis really wants us to take away, and it's this. Here's a point that I think really does matter. Lewis is really saying something like this. Remember that conversation you had with JRR Tolkien back in September 1931? It's all about the importance of stories. Stories in general, stories and Christianity. And the key point that Lewis is making is this, that in effect, Narnia is a story. It is a rewriting of the Christian story, and it is all about connecting that story with the story of individual people, above all, the Pevensie children as they enter Narnia. So let's just think through what happens in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The children enter Narnia. It's a beautifully narrated scene, and really it captures a sense of amazement, surprise, wonder, puzzlement at what on earth is going on. And the children go into this, and as they go into it, they meet people, and they come back with different stories about what Narnia is. Is it the realm of the White Witch? She owns it. Or is it something to do with this Aslan thing, which isn't here at the moment, but one day is going to come back? And the children begin to realize they are presented with a world of which there are multiple stories. And you have to find a way of working out which one is right, which one is to be trusted. And Lewis, I think, is really opening up this massive point that we live in a culture that is shaped by stories. And some of these stories are of, we come about as a result of a blind, purposeless process. Others saying, no, there's meaning and purpose in life and in our individual lives. And Lewis is saying we've got to find a way of realizing there are these multiple stories and begin to appreciate how we can tell the difference. And it's a classic problem in the theory of narratives, as you will know. And you might say, well, you can look at evidence these narratives are true, or you might look at the degree of sense that they create, or you might look at the idea of habitability. It's a very big theme these days. Is this a way of thinking? Is this a worldview that I could actually step into and meaningfully inhabit? And for Lewis, that's a very important question. So Lewis wants to begin by getting this point out there. There are multiple stories, and we have to make a choice. Which one do we trust? But then he makes a second point. I think it's this second point that really is so interesting. The second point goes like this. Each of the children in Narnia have their own individual story. Then they step into Narnia, and in a sense they find that their stories get caught up in the story of Narnia. They begin to become part of it. They begin to move it on. If you like, they're not passive spectators. They are active participants in this story, and they find meaning in knowing that they are doing this. So again, this emphasis on meaning, which is such an important theme for Lewis, that we in effect find meaning by becoming part of something that's bigger, and that is something that we can move ahead in our own ways and find meaning and value as a result of doing so. If you're a psychologist, think of people like Crystal Park, who really goes to town on this particular point. So what Lewis is doing is not simply telling a series of wonderful stories. I think, the Chronicles of Narnia have really established themselves as, standard fare in the British literary scene. It is that Lewis is trying to use these as a way of illustrating how each of us needs to find our position in a greater story, and that this will, in effect, bring us peace and joy and a sense of fulfillment. Now, there are many points I could talk about in relation to the Chronicles of Narnia, and obviously I'm going to open myself up for questioning later. Let me just single out one theme that I think is really quite important. One of them is that I mentioned that Lewis, in some ways, is trying to use the Chronicles of Narnia narratives to illuminate some Christian ideas. And one of the ideas Lewis tries to illuminate is the idea of sin. It's a difficult idea. And Lewis does this in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And he does it in relation to one character in particular, and that is Eustace Scrubb, who Lewis tends to describe in rather nasty ways. I don't think Lewis likes him very much, but Lewis brings out the point that Eustace Scrubb is greedy. And he tries to make the point that when you are taken over by a desire, then you cease to be free. You become entrapped. You find you cannot break free from the tyranny of this desire that is overwhelming you. And Lewis, in effect, reworks this into a narrative in which Eustace doesn't just think greedy thoughts. He actually becomes a dragon. And Lewis here is drawing on the Norse myth of Fafnir, the dragon who goes to sleep over a treasure hoard. And the point that Lewis is making is that Eustace finds he cannot break free from this overwhelming desire, this overwhelming greed. And so the question then is there any way I can break free from this? And Eustace tries to do this by scratching his dragon skin. Nothing happens. And is reduced to despair. Who is going to set me free? And then Aslan appears, scratches off the dragon skin, chucks Eustace into a deep well. He emerges healed. And one of the points that Lewis is trying to make is that sin is actually something that captures us or overwhelms us. We need to be set free by somebody else. So it's a very interesting idea. But now I want to move on, and I've talked a bit about Lewis writing stories, and we can talk about any of the other stories if you like later. But I need now to talk about two of Lewis's works that do stand out. And these are, number one, his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and number two, his book, Mere Christianity, which is probably the best-selling introduction to Christianity there is. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit because they are very important to who Lewis is and actually quite interesting in their own way. Surprised by Joy is really Lewis narrating his own life story. And in fact, he's doing something which older people are able to do, and that is, he wrote this in a letter to one of his friends, that when you come to quite an advanced stage in your life, you're able to look back over your life and you begin to see patterns falling into shape that you weren't aware of at the time. In other words, that your life makes a lot more sense when you look back at it rather than when you're in the midst of it. And Lewis, in effect, felt he could tell a story of his own personal meanderings, yearnings, wanderings, and his final discovery of Christianity. But in many ways, it is very much, if you like, Lewis holding up a mirror to himself and, in effect, being quite honest about who he is, what he hoped to be, what actually happened. And it is actually a very enjoyable read. What Lewis is trying to do is not simply describe his own complicated journey to faith, but actually all the issues he encountered along the way and the kind of thoughts that were going through his mind as he reflected on what was happening to him, on what he wanted to be, and things like this. And it's a very interesting book in many ways. It corresponds to a general genre. Lewis makes a comparison, for example, with Augustine of Hippo's Confessions, written in the 5th century, which is really trying to say, this is my story, but in another sense, it's not my story, because it's a story of me becoming part of a bigger story and the difference that made to me. And actually, it is extremely well written, and I've given you a quote from it already about Lewis's tension between reason and imagination, and that, I think, will give you a sense of the quality of the prose. This is really worth reading. If you want to make a list of a few works by Lewis you should read, I would say this is one of them. But the idea of joy is also very important. The title, Surprised by Joy, comes from Wordsworth, and Lewis develops this idea of joy in his own way. I'm going to talk to you now about Lewis and emotions, because this is one of the most unique and interesting aspects of Lewis. Lewis is not simply someone who writes rationally. He's not simply somebody who writes imaginative fiction which captures your imagination. He also believes that individual human feelings are significant, that in some way the way we feel is actually indicative of who we really are, what we are actually meant to be. And Lewis uses the word joy in a technical sense. The technical sense is this. For Lewis, joy is a sense of yearning passionately for something. You're not quite sure what it is, but something that is going to satisfy, something of supreme importance, which you don't have, and you begin to wonder if you ever will have. So if you like, it's a bittersweet feeling. It's a sense of yearning for something that is really, really important, and at the same time, not really being sure it's there, and not being sure you'll ever be able to find it. And so Lewis is really using this idea of joy to mean this sense of wondering, the sense of hoping that there is something really worth finding, but you haven't actually found it yet. And the argument that Lewis will make is that what he was searching for was actually searching for him. But it's a very well-constructed argument, and Lewis's argument really goes something like this. I'll describe it very briefly. Basically, what Lewis is saying is the fact that we have this deep sense of emptiness or sort of dissatisfaction, or a sense that there's something missing from our lives, is actually a reflection of of who we are and what we are meant to be. In other words, we are meant, Lewis says, to relate to God. If we don't do that, then we have a sense of emptiness, and that sense of emptiness is, if you like, a clue to who we really are. And Lewis uses that language of clue a lot. Think of, for example, in Mere Christianity, where he talks about right and wrong being clues to the meaning of the universe. They don't prove anything, but they are pieces of evidence which accumulate and give you a sense that there is this bigger picture and this way of making sense of it. So that's very important. Surprised by Joy, definitely worth reading, as is Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity, as I said, is a published text of Lewis's 4 series of broadcast talks for the BBC. And when you read it, you will feel you are perhaps entering a slightly different world. It's a world of the 1950s, long since gone by. So at times Lewis uses words or phrases that don't immediately make sense to us. We have to kind of reflect on them. But nevertheless, they remain enormously significant. Why? Because Lewis really is trying to explain Christianity in very simple terms, using very homely analogies, not kind of way going soft on rationality, but really trying to make these as communicable as he can. What does it mean to, be joyful? What is the basis of hope? What's all this about? And he, in effect, takes us through these questions in very short sections, 1,800 words, some of them, 1,200 others. They're very brief. And I have to say they are beautifully written and they really capture your attention. I had to give a lecture in Lithuania, of all places, about 5 years ago. I was then talking to the Lithuanian government about how they might teach science and religion in the schools. That's one of my specialist interests. And I gave a lecture at university, and then I was asked if I would mind giving one more lecture while I was there, and that was on C.S. Lewis. And I found that baffling. I mean, who reads C.S. Lewis in Lithuania? Anyway, we went to the cathedral in the center of Vilnius, and I gave a lecture. It had to be translated sentence by sentence. And it was the biggest audience I had for any of my lectures in Lithuania. And they were mostly older people and their grandchildren. And afterwards, I asked my interpreter to tell me what was going on, because everyone was crying. All I was doing was talking about C.S. Lewis, and you aren't crying. And he went away and talked, and then he came back to me and says, here's the deal. He said, these people, during the Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which has only ended quite recently, they were not allowed to live normal Christian lives, and they depended on pirated Russian translations of C.S. Lewis to keep them going during those dark times. And in many reasons, the reason they come was because Lewis was kind of their patron saint. He kept them going during very difficult times. That gives you an idea of the reach of Lewis. I think that is very significant. So now I've talked about some of the works Lewis wrote. Let's come back to him as a person. So we're now looking at Lewis in the early 1950s, and what is happening is that Lewis is beginning to make lots of enemies at Oxford. And in part, the problem really was very simple, and it was this. Lewis was employed as a tutorial fellow in English at Magdalen College, Oxford, and he was expected to teach and also to write learned books and papers. Lewis hadn't written many learned books and papers, but he had written the Screwtape Letters, Chronicles of Narnia. But his academic peers didn't think that was quite what they were looking for. And so Lewis really began to feel that he was being critiqued as not sufficiently academic. And he dealt with this by publishing a major work for Oxford University Press on 16th century English drama. And it was very well received. He was made a fellow of the British Academy as a result. So in effect, that began to solve the problem. But really, there was hostility towards Lewis in Oxford. And the time came when JRR Tolkien suggested he needed to find a position elsewhere. And Tolkien had something in mind, because the University of Cambridge decided that they needed a second chair in English literature And Tolkien was on the selection board, and they, in effect, felt that Lewis might be the right person for the job. So they approached Lewis, and Lewis wrote back the next day to the Vice Chancellor of Cambridge saying, "No, thank you." And Tolkien was baffled and actually very deeply hurt. I went to see Lewis and asked, "Why have you said no? We had to offer to somebody else now." Lewis said, "Well, I just don't want to leave Oxford." And Tolkien was quite angry because if Lewis had bothered to ask, it had been perfectly possible to keep his house in Oxford and go to Cambridge during the week and be a professor there. And Lewis said, "Oh, but they've offered to somebody else now." But here's the story. The second person they offered it to knew who the first person they'd offered it to was and thought that he was the best choice. So she turned it down, knowing that then it would be offered to Lewis again. So there's a very happy ending, and Lewis went to Cambridge. And I think it's fair to say Lewis really flourished in Cambridge. It was like going into a new environment, and he began to write some of those massive intellectual books, which we remember. One of the best of those is An Experiment in Criticism, which is a beautiful account of what it is we are doing when we try to read a book. It's about books, in fact, opening our eyes, allowing us to see through other people's eyes. And Lewis has this wonderful description of the importance of literature as, in effect, giving you 1,000 eyes to look at a complicated world, and yet it's still you who sees. If you like, it heals the wounds without abolishing the privilege of being an individual. But he also began to write a different kind of apologetic work. In the first phase of his apologetic ministry, Lewis is really writing to an audience outside the church, to people who are wondering what Christianity is and wondering somebody could help them to understand it and make sense of it. Lewis did that quite well, but at Cambridge, he deliberately changed his approach. He now wrote apologetics to people inside the church, reassuring them about their faith and trying them to help them grow in their faith. So it's quite significant as a change. Lewis was very happy at Cambridge. There were difficulties, and one of the most sad of these, as many of you will know, is the death of his wife, Joy. Lewis married late in life, he married Joy, and Joy unfortunately developed cancer. And so Lewis was involved in nursing her, looking after her, always hoping there'd be remissions. Sometimes there were remissions. Then again, it came back. And it was very, very distressing for Lewis, and Joy Gresham eventually died of cancer. I think Lewis really found that to be quite traumatic. If any of you have read Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, published under a pen name in 1961, you'll see the sense of raw emotion at his sheer sense of grief at his wife's death, and reflecting on what all this means and what it has to say about the process of suffering, bereavement, and all these things. It's a very moving book. I must warn you, it's actually quite a grating, quite a raw book, and you may find it difficult to read, but it is well worth reading. So Lewis then was on his own for the final years of his life. And he died in 1963, in fact, on the same day as JFK was shot in Dallas, Texas. So in ending this talk, to reflect on very briefly the question, why are we talking about Lewis today? Because Lewis would have been astonished that so many people have come to hear a talk on Lewis when Lewis thought he would be forgotten after 5 years. He said, 5 years, I'm gone. And you can see why I might say that, because in many ways Lewis was straddling the boundary between modernism and postmodernism. In many ways, he was writing for an audience which no longer existed. And so people began to feel that Lewis kind of way just was beached, that in effect he was writing for an audience which in effect was dying out. And I think that to begin with, that seemed to be an accurate analysis. And then things began to happen. One of those things was Walter Hooper, who Lewis got to know very late in life, and Hooper really took it upon himself to be Lewis's literary executor, made sure that his books stayed in print. He did a deal with William Collins so that they would keep the Narnia books in print, but as those would make money, they would also keep all of Lewis's other books in print as well. So that in effect meant they would be available. But what happened was that in effect Lewis bounced back. And we don't fully understand this. Maybe some of you here tonight have got ideas about this. But what really happened was that people began to reconnect with the appeal to the imagination. They began to reconnect with the whole idea of stories as a way of making sense of life. Christianity as a story that we connect up with. And I think above all, just the sense that Lewis was a very able and articulate communicator who you enjoyed reading, whether you agreed with them or not, and actually opened your mind and your thoughts to various ways of thinking. I still read Lewis to this day. I have to say my own experience is that when I turn to a passage I've already read and read it again, I'm kind of impressed once more by the prose, but also very often see things I may have missed the first or the second or third time round. So he is really a reader that repays study. So Lewis might be surprised that we're here tonight, but I don't think any of us really are, because we can see there's something about this writer which really has the ability to communicate, to engage, and really to keep us going. Now listen, there's much more I could say, but I think it would be much more fun if you were to take control of the conversation, and that is why I'm going to stop speaking now, and we'll have a brief notice about how we're going to proceed, but the basic idea is you are going to what we speak about for the rest of the evening, okay? So I'll hand over to Vaughan, who'll explain how we're going to proceed.
Let's restart, and if you want to ask a question, raise a hand, and right up towards the front here, please.
I was going to ask... Oh, right. Beg your pardon. Okay, let's hope it works this time. Many of my friends, their favourite book is, in fact, The Great Divorce, which is another storybook, sort of going into themes of life after death. So I just wondered if you got a few words on that book as well.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, The Great Divorce is well worth reading, very, very well written. There's a debate amongst Lewis scholars as to what this refrigerium actually is, as you will know. But the key point is, in many ways, Lewis is trying to get across the idea that the way in which we live in this world is shaped by our understanding of what the bigger picture is. So if you like, it's a very helpful, imaginative way of trying to get this sense of there being this bigger picture. But there's also an awful lot of other theological reflection going on at the same time. So I think, to be brief, it is definitely worth reading. There are points at which you will find you have to stop and think, what does he mean by that? And it's partly because this work was written in the late 1940s, so it is picking up some cultural themes which we can't relate to now. But it definitely is worth reading, certainly if some of my friends, when asked to name the best Lewis book, will mention precisely that book because it's so interesting. Thank you. Let's keep going.
Hello. Hello, thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering, could you speak a little bit more about what it was that changed, that effectively changed for Lewis in terms of him moving from atheism to Christianity? Because you've said that it was the concept of the story. Could you expand on that maybe a little bit?
Yes, thank you for that. Lewis does talk about this, and if you like, it's almost like Lewis saying, I stepped into a new way of seeing things. That's a very important idea for Lewis, the way we see things. And as a result, something that I'd once seen as meaningless now became meaningful. Things I once thought were pointless or of no value suddenly became very important, very valuable, and very meaningful. So Lewis really is expressing this idea that when you look at something, you are always looking through theoretical lenses. To begin with, you may think, I'm not looking at things through theoretical lenses. That's because you're using inherited ones, or ones you've borrowed without realizing it. And so Lewis is really making the point, to go back to that analogy of spectacles, that the spectacles you wear shape what you see. And Lewis's argument would be that Christianity gives you a set of spectacles that allow you to see things as they really are. So it's a very important theme. What difference does it make to him practically? Well, Lewis actually answers that question. Lewis says that one of the direct consequences of my becoming a Christian was I stopped keeping a diary. Now, I have to say, as a biographer of Lewis, that is a profound irritation. Because actually, his diary was very, very interesting. But he said, why did I stop it? Well, because it's self-aggrandizing. That doesn't matter anymore. In many ways, you keep diaries to justify yourself to yourself and critique your friends. But Lewis, in effect, was really saying, I don't need this anymore. I don't need validation. I don't need this affirmation because I've got it in my Christian faith. So it did make quite a big difference to him. And of course, particularly towards the end of his life, when he was suffering from cancer and he knew he was dying, and so had time to just reflect on bigger questions in life, and it really did make a very big difference to him then. So the answer is, it really made an enormous amount of difference. But here's a point I want to make. Actually, Lewis's conversion in some ways was imaginative, in some ways it was intellectual. There was some emotion. He talks about, getting down on his knees, or most reluctant convert in all England, But actually, when you read him more closely, the overall impression you get is that the major impact, the major difference Christianity made was to the way he saw things, the way he thought, the way he hoped, the way he lived. It wasn't really a very emotional conversion. So what I think I could say is that in many ways, this was Lewis, in effect, stepping out of one world into another world and saying, I prefer living in this world because I think it's more reliable. Thank you.
Can I just sneak in?
Thank you.
We'll have one question, and then if we can have the next one ready. So put up a hand, and then I'll tell you where we'll go to next. That'll be just there next, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. This is a related question in a sense, but it's on the role of Tolkien as a Catholic in influencing C.S. Lewis. And was Lewis actually, I was going to say tempted, perhaps that's the wrong choice of words, but was he interested in joining the Catholic Church, or was it simply, did he feel more at home in the Church of England? Was it simply because being the established church, it was that much easier? I'd be interested to hear your...
No, that's a very good question. Let me tell you what I think. Again, different people will take different views on this, so it's quite difficult, but I think what I can say would be fairly reliable. Lewis's friendship with Tolkien was unexpected, because Lewis came from Northern Ireland, and back in the 1890s, up to before the First World War, Protestants and Catholics just lived separate lives. They didn't interact. Very few Protestants had Catholic friends. Very few Catholics had Protestant friends. So when Lewis arrived at Oxford and began to develop a friendship with a Catholic, he initially thought, I shouldn't be doing this. But he then thought, well, this is so interesting and so rewarding. And so Lewis, although he never was tempted to become a Catholic, he's very clear about that, did shift his emphasis away from any particular denomination towards the idea of mere Christianity, a generalized Christianity. In other words, a form of Christianity which is what underlies all forms of Christianity, and for Lewis, that was what really matters. And so Lewis is very, very clear, for example, in mere Christianity. I'm not going to tell you what form of Christianity you should adopt. I'm simply going to try and explain what this thing called Christianity is, and let you decide where you go. But interestingly, if you use that analogy that Lewis presents in the opening sections of Mere Christianity, the idea of a hall with doorways, and the doorways lead to rooms in which there are chairs and food and fires. Lewis's point is that the hallway is really important, but we all have to find our way to a room, because that's where you actually live. And so what Lewis is saying is, please choose your own denomination, but what I'm going to do is say, Christianity is more important than any denomination, and secondly, I am not going to get involved in this discussion. It's up to you to decide where you go. So that, I think, really is where we are on that one. Lewis had many friends who were Orthodox, Catholic, Presbyterian, and others, but made it fairly clear he was happy where he was, and maybe it's because Anglicanism was the Church of England, the national church. And certainly Lewis, in reading people like Richard Hooker and other religious poets of the Renaissance really reflect on how their Anglican identity was reflected in their poetry. But there's a mental experiment I've often conducted, and I'll tell you what it is, and I haven't yet answered my own question. Supposing Lewis had ended up being appointed to a position at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. The reason I say that is because they gave him a DD because they were so impressed by his new approach to theology. But supposing he'd gone there, my reading of Lewis is he would have gone to the local Church of Scotland parish because it was the sort of the natural place to go. But I can't prove that, and there's nowhere where he says that. So we'll have to leave it there. But good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a moment, and next hand up so we can get one ready. Madam, after that. Yeah. Keep going. Speak. We'll repeat if we can, and let's try and sort out another microphone. But just speak up, and then we'll repeat it.
What is it in Lewis's view about stories' relation to the nature of the world that enables it to convey theological themes in a way that can't be conveyed in nonfiction?
You want to repeat the question?
I'll repeat the question. What is it in Lewis's view about stories that gives them this particular attractiveness and relevance? Is there some kind of theological foundation? Good question. Lewis doesn't reflect on this as much as I would have liked him to, but Tolkien did. And I think you can find Tolkien's fingerprints over Lewis's reflections. I don't know if you've read Carl Jung's on Carl Jung on archetypes. This idea that there's some pre-existing templates, narrative templates in the human mind. So in fact, when we tell stories, A, we're primed to do so, and B, there are certain set forms we tend to adopt. Lewis doesn't really go that way. He tends to go more the way of Tolkien, which is that bearing the image of God, in effect, is about having a narrative substructure in the way in which you think. And in his poem Mythopoeia, which is well worth reading, it's not that long, Tolkien talks about the idea of being made by God to tell stories, and that in creating new stories, we are actually fundamentally retelling the original story, which is a version of the Christian faith. And so what Lewis is really telling us on this is that the use of stories is not some kind of ornament, some kind of useful way of making something otherwise dull a bit more interesting. He's saying there's something about the way we are as human beings, which means that we tell stories, and something about the way we are as human beings, which means that these stories actually, whether we realize it or not, are actually reflecting back towards a bigger story and in turn pointing us towards those. So the answer is yes, there is a bit of theology going on in the background here. What I will say to you, though, is that it is understated and it doesn't intrude on the stories that Lewis tells. Likewise with Tolkien, it's very, very clear that Tolkien has this deep sense of stories being something deep and significant and really meaningful. It's absolutely essential to who we are as human beings. But again, Tolkien doesn't kind of force his own ideas on those stories. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, there is something going on there at a more theological level, but it doesn't intrude. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, there, and then go there. I'm probably going to need to stay quite soon because I don't think the microphone works, Glenn. So just...
All right. Yes. What are your thoughts on Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis?
What are my thoughts on Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis? I think it's very original.
Would you mind just...
Oh, yes, sorry, I should have told you.
A little bit of sense of what
Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia, in effect says that there is a sort of template lying behind the Narnia Chronicles, and that is, in effect, medieval astrology. And in doing that, really what Michael Ward is saying is that Lewis gives us multiple hints of the influence of astrology on his writing of the Chronicles of Narnia, but it's never explicit. You have to look for it very, very closely. And this means that, for example, each of the Chronicles of Narnia, there are 7 chronicles, there are 7 of these symbols. He will say that in many ways, each of the Chronicles of Narnia seems to have its own distinct character, and that is shaped by the planetary symbol that lies behind it. For example, Prince Caspian is really reflecting Mars. Mars is both about war, but also Mars is the beginning of spring. Our month of March, really, it comes from the word Mars. So he's saying that in Prince Caspian, you have both the theme of war, but also an excessive amount of reference to vegetation, to green things. So my feeling is, I think there is something here, but I think it's not quite as evident, not perhaps as clearly stated as Michael Ward suggests, but it was a very good book. I think it's a very good suggestion, and it certainly is very suggestive, even though I'm not absolutely sure it's right. Okay?
And another hand. Thank you, sir.
What is do I need to use me? Is it? Thank you so much for your talk. So for a lot of people here, it seems like reading Chronicles of Narnia is what made them fall in love with stories. For Lewis, obviously, he didn't read Chronicles of Narnia. So who would he have read that would have made him fall in love with stories? Who were his biggest literary influences?
Well, as you might expect, there have been a lot of studies done on this. And one of them I read about 3 or 4 years ago suggests at least 150 influences. And so, I mean, what I think you have to say is that Lewis, in many ways, is reaching wide and going deep in terms of drawing on a rich range of traditional literary approaches, authors, themes, and so on, and just weaving them into the Chronicles of Narnia. And you have what I suppose is a paradox, which is in one sense the Chronicles of Narnia is very derivative because so many of these themes can be tracked back elsewhere. And yet the way in which Lewis puts them together really is very original. So I think what you're seeing here is a classic position of somebody who is deeply rooted and steeped in the literary tradition, and you naturally want to involve that in what you're writing. And in doing so, of course, you're being a bit derivative, but he's being very creative in the way in which he uses them. So I think if you would ask me to single out some of these, I mean, Dante is there, I think, in a big way. Dante is one of the writers that Lewis quotes most. In fact, there was an article in one of the Italian Dante journals a couple of years back just focusing on Lewis's use of Dante because it's so interesting. But I think that, George MacDonald has to be mentioned here. And I think also Tolkien. Now, because I haven't talked about the Inklings, but maybe I just ought to say a few words about them here. Because the Inklings were a group of people who loved Christianity and loved literature and saw ways of kind of bringing them together. And they provided, in effect, a group of critical friends who would both support and criticize at the same time. One of them, of course, was JRR Tolkien. Charles Williams also was there for a while, and Williams, I think, does influence Lewis quite significantly, particularly in The Hideous Strength. So I think that there is something definitely going on there. But I think the way I see it is not Lewis borrowing, as rather Lewis, in fact, building on a rich tradition to which he has contributed and in which, in many ways, he's extended as well. Thank you.
One more.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGrath, for this talk and for the ability to kind of pick your brain on these things. I'm thinking about Lewis and Tolkien together. They both show such a great love of nature, the animals, the trees, just the outdoors. And I'm wondering, in what ways can we take things from both of these writers in support of our contemporary concern for the environment, climate control, climate care, those sorts of things?
Thank you. Yes, you're right. I mean, that's a very fair observation. I mean, both Lewis and Tolkien are drawing on the medieval bestiaries, which really are attempts to capture the breadth and the depth of natural history. It's very, very important. And certainly, there are themes in Lewis which are very relevant to this day. I can, if you go back to his essay, The Abolition of Man, you see there Lewis very often saying, in effect, we talk about doing things that are natural. What we're really doing is just controlling nature and making it do what we want. And it's expressing concern that one day we're simply going to make nature serve our purposes. It's instrumentalized. And in the Chronicles of Narnia, you have this deep sense that every aspect of creation is really important, that it has its own role to play, even if it's presented sometimes in a rather almost in the guise of, animals doing things, but the key theme is that nature as a whole, God's creation, is significant and every element is important. And I think that you can easily use both Lewis and Tolkien as the basis of a Christian environmentalism. I don't think they would object to you doing that, because it's very, very clear that both of them loved nature, and Tolkien in particular was deeply critical of the use of technology to master nature. In many ways, his experience was shaped by the First World War, but he also, I think, saw what the beginnings of industrial approaches to farming did to parts of England that he knew very, very well, and just felt we're losing something and we can't stop this. So there is this sense of things are happening we can't undo, but at least we can try and say these things are really important. We need to find a way of preserving them. Thank you.
We better make this the last question.
Thank you for your talk. So I've only read Mere Christianity and Surprised by Joy, so I associate Lewis most of all with his idea of humans longing and yearning for something that we can't put our finger on until we discover that it's God. So where do you see that theme in the Chronicles of Narnia?
Thank you. I think you're right. That is a very important theme for Lewis. You may get it from Augustine or from many other sources, but it's certainly a very important aspect of Lewis. Where would we see that in the Chronicles of Narnia? In a lot of places. Let me give you two examples. Think of the children's response to Aslan. Okay? If you look at each of these, you'll see that what Lewis is doing is bringing together a little bit of William James, a little bit of some German writers, Rudolf Otto being a very good example, with this idea of the tremendous mystery, but also a lot of Augustine and the Romantic poets on desire. And for some are overwhelmed by Aslan, some are excited by Aslan, some are just drawn to Aslan with this sense of inexplicable wonder. And you'll see it there. You can also see it, of course, in The Last Battle, towards the end of it, when there's this deep desire to be in this new world, like Jewel the Unicorn. This is where I really belong. I never knew it till now, but I do. There's this very strong sense of yearning to be in this other place. So I can see it in an awful lot of places. It's one of those themes where Lewis consistently brings it in, but he reframes it, rephrases it, so in effect it's never dull repetition, it's always reworking. But it's a very important theme for Lewis throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. I would say it almost is a leitmotif, and sort of a theme that really is there throughout and actually gives a sense of unity as you go through the narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, very much indeed. You've mentioned lots of Lewis books. There are lots out there. We do encourage you to find new treasures in Lewis, and I'd strongly recommend this book by Alistair himself, C.S. Lewis, A Life, and there are copies available for sale at the back. Alistair will be there, happy to sign copies, so you could to get a book tonight if you can. So once again, Alistair, huge thanks to you for a very stimulating lecture and for answering those questions so well.
For some very good questions, I thought, too.
They were. So thank you very much indeed. Let's give you a round of applause.